Hi, this is Sarit Switzer, and welcome to the It Is Taught podcast, a podcast devoted to the teachings of Rabbi Shneur Zalman of Liadi as recorded in his most famous work, the Tanya. My hope for this show is to make these teachings accessible and relatable to the average person, regardless of prior Jewish education or affiliation. The episodes follow the prescribed daily study portions and are meant to serve as practical lessons in how to live your life as your true self and develop an authentic and powerful relationship with your Creator. I have personally experienced the effects the study of this work has had on me, and I'm excited to share what I can of this knowledge with you. So please join me on this journey of learning, self-growth, and connection with your source. Hi, and welcome to the It Is Taught podcast. This is episode 303 for the 25th of Elul in a leap year. Today, we are going to have one of those episodes that leaves us with a question. So heads up for today, we're going to bring up a question and it's not going to have a resolution. We're going to be left hanging, pondering, but sometimes that's good because sometimes it's good to have questions. Questions allow us to really take the time to be disturbed about something. And when we're disturbed about something, our brain is occupied with it. And when our brain is occupied with Torah ideas, and we start thinking about, various possibilities and concerns or whatever, this is a good thing. This is a way for us to really engage in Torah study to the fullest ability, to really channel our thinking capacities towards godly purposes. This is kind of like the basis of the Gemara. The Gemara is all based on these like question and answer kind of things. And a lot of sichas of the Rebbe and just many Jewish teachings often come with this idea of bringing up questions. The question sometimes is more insightful sometimes than even the answers in a certain sense. So the answer sometimes can be like, the answers obviously are important on a certain level, but really Judaism is more about questions than it is about answers. There's always questions. And I think that's one of the most beautiful things about Judaism is that we're such a questioning religion, that we're never satisfied. It's like people say that Jews, the way they answer a question is with another question, that kind of thing. So that brings us to today's episode. So what's the question that we're going to bring up in today's episode? So we'll understand it a little bit more when we get into the text. But the basic question that's going to be brought up is that we're going to be bringing in a teaching from the Arizal. The Arizal was a famous Kabbalist named Rav Yitzchak Luria, who his Kabbalistic insights and the way that his rendition of Kabbalah is actually the basis of much of Chabad Hasidus comes from him. Most of what we know about Kabbalah and the sephiros and all those things come from him. And so the Arizal wrote extensively about all of the different sephiros, all of the different manifest parts of God, and sort of mapping them out on all levels, the highest levels, the lowest levels, all of those kind of things. And in his teaching, we find a teaching, which this is where it's going to get really questionable. We find this teaching about Moses, about Moshe Rabeinu. And what is the teaching there? The teaching about Moshe Rabeinu is all about Moshe's prophetic abilities and what Moshe was able to see and what Moshe was not able to see on a spiritual level, what he was able to experience, what levels of godliness was Moshe able to experience. And what we'll actually learn is that Moshe, as great as he was, and he was considered to be the greatest prophet that ever lived, and pretty much that ever will live, as far as I understand it, he actually was quite limited in his ability to see God. There was much of godliness that was concealed from him. In terms of certain levels of godliness. So the obvious question comes up, which is the question of today's section, which is that if Moshe, who is the greatest prophet that ever lived, nobody could ever experience anything greater or anything more than Moshe, if he was limited in terms of his abilities, in terms of his spiritual capacities to be able to, in terms of what he was able to experience in terms of godliness, how then could the Arizal not only write about Moshe's limited experience, but write about things that are beyond Moshe's experience, write about those things that Moshe could not experience, talking extensively about these realms that were way above Moshe Rabeinu's lived experience. Like, how could that be? Was the Arizal greater than Moshe? Was he a greater prophet than Moshe? We know that's not true, because we know that Moshe Rabeinu was the greatest prophet that ever lived. So how is it that the Arizal was able to speak about these things? What's going on? Did the Kabbalists have something that Moshe didn't have? Were they on some level higher than Moshe Rabeinu? So we're not going to answer that question today. So I apologize. We will get to the answer tomorrow. We're going to start discussing the answer tomorrow, but today we're really just going to delve into that question. So to get into that question and to begin today, we're going to get into the text, and for context, we're going to be beginning Epistle 19 in Iggeres HaKodesh. And Epistle 19 of Iggeres HaKodesh begins with a citation. This is a citation from Tehillim, chapter 104, verse 2, which says, Ote o kasalma, which literally means he, meaning God, wraps himself with light as with a garment. And so we're talking about God in terms of light, wrapping himself with light, like as if like God's garment, God's clothing is a light. So this epistle is going to talk about this. What does this mean, that God wraps himself with a light as if it's clothing, as one wraps themselves in clothing? That's kind of like the intro to all of this. Okay, now the Arizal goes on and he says that we find that in the Likutei Torah of the Arizal, so of this Rav Yitzchak Luria, one of his works was called Likutei Torah, and that work was divided up in terms of the parshas, the sections of the Torah that we read over the course of the year. So in the parsha of Kitisa, as well as in the parsha of Vayikra, in this Likutei Torah, it's written that the Arizal writes that the understanding that Moshe Rabeinu of blessed memory had was not on the level of the inward aspect of supernal Chochmah, which is called Father of Atzilus, Abba of Atzilus. Okay, so it's a very lofty idea here. We don't have to really get too into detail about what these things mean, but basically, you may be familiar with some of these terms already. So Chochmah, right? Chochmah is very, very high up there. It's the first manifested sphera on a certain level. It's the sphera of it corresponds to the intellectual capacity for intuition, that initial spark of insight. And so that level of Chochmah, supernal Chochmah, which is the Chochmah that's found in the highest of all worlds, the world of Atzilus, is what's known as the Abba of Atzilus, the Father of Atzilus. So the Arizal taught that Moshe Rabeinu did not understand this level. It was beyond his understanding. This level of the inward aspect of the Chochmah, the supernal Chochmah, was beyond, in Atzilus, was beyond Moshe Rabeinu's understanding. And so all the more so since we know that if we're going to say that Moshe Rabeinu did not understand this level of Chochmah, so then for sure he did not understand the level of Keter, which is above Chochmah. So Keter, again, is like, it's like above, it can't, sometimes we say Chochmah is the first sphera, sometimes we say Keter is the first sphera. It gets very confusing, I know, but like we spoke about this in previous times, that it depends on the vantage point that you're looking at it. So Chochmah is sort of like the first like manifest sphera, it's the first intellectual sphera, but Keter is the one that comes from above it. Keter corresponds to the will, and Keter is also sometimes referred to as Arich Anpin, which is the long face, it's called. And it's associated with will, it's associated with desire and all of that. And so if we say that Moshe Rabeinu did not understand the inward aspect of the supernal Chochmah, then for sure he didn't understand the aspect of the Keter either, because Keter is above Chochmah. But rather, then what did Moshe Rabeinu understand? If he didn't understand the inward aspect of the supernal Chochmah, he understood the external aspect of Chochmah as it was vested within Bina. So I've mentioned this before, but I'll say it again. It could be useful for those of you that are not super familiar with these sephiros to either Google kind of like an outline of the sephiros or take notes along the way and kind of keep it clear in your head where these spheres are oriented and what they correspond to. So Chochmah, again, is that initial spark of insight, that intuition, and then Bina is the elaboration of that, the analysis, the elucidation, all of that. So the Chochmah becomes vested within the Bina. The Bina is the next sphere on it down on the ladder. It's on the left side. higher up. So we're saying basically here that that Moshe understood the external aspect of Chokhmah, so not the inner aspect of Chokhmah, but he understood the external aspect of Chokhmah, which was vested within Bina, which was vested within the 7 lower sephiros, which are, again, those 7 midos, and they're sometimes called Zer Anpin, the small face, the small countenance. That's what sometimes those 7 lower sephiros, which are associated with the emotive attributes, they're sometimes called the Zer Anpin. And this is how he understood the secrets of the Torah. And the Alter Rebbe goes on and he says that this supernal Chokhmah actually flows down until the lower 4 sephiros, which are those lower 4 sephiros, if you've been following along, are Netzach, Hod, Yisod, and Malchus. Those are the lower 4 sephiros. And that is, in this lower 4 sephiros, that's where Moshe Rabbeinu's understanding came from, and his prophecy became manifest in an inward way, meaning in a way of inwardness and Netzach, Hod, Yisod, and Malchus. So let's just recap that. So basically on a simple level, so Moshe Rabeinu, so we have the 10 sephiros, right? And then we have Keter, that's above the 10 sephiros. So and for each of the 10 sephiros, there's the superficial, external aspect of them, and then there's the inward aspect of them. So it's kind of like, it's like just very, very superficially. It's like, what do you see on the outside and what's really going on the inside? So it's like you could see a person and you see them, you see their face, you see their features, all that stuff, but do you really know them? Do you really know them in an inward way? That's a different story, right? So we're learning here today that Moshe Rabeinu, his knowledge of the higher sephiros was in a more superficial way. He did not understand supernal Chokhmah in an inward way. Rather, he just knew it in a superficial way as that superficiality became vested within Bina, which became vested within the 7 emotive sephiros below it. And the only time, on the only level that Moshe Rabeinu did get to have this like internal appreciation, this inward appreciation, was in the 4 lower sephiros. But above, continues the Alter Rebbe, above these 4 lower sephiros, he didn't have any kind of internal understanding of it, any kind of deeper understanding, but rather he just understood it in this like backhanded way, the external aspect of Chokhmah that was vested within Bina, that was vested and enclosed and flowed down into the inward aspect of the Netzach, Hod, Yisod, and Malchus. So there is a connection between the sephiros in the sense that the external aspect of a higher sephira becomes vested within the inward aspect of a lower sephira, and so forth and so forth and so forth. And so basically, the inward aspect of Netzach, Hod, Yisod, and Malchus is coming from the superficial aspects of the sephiros that are above it. And that's the way that Moshe was able to experience the sephiros, was in a superficial way, all the way just in terms of how they were able to be manifest within these lower sephiros in an internal way. And the Alter Rebbe says that this process by which Moshe Rabeinu was able to experience this chokhmah, but only by way of it being enclosed in the inner aspect of Netzach, Hod, Yisod, and Malchus, is what's known as the Novlot Chokhmah Shelemala Torah. This is the Novlot, the like flowing down of the supernal Chokhmah, which is Torah, on the level of Zer Anpin, which is again the level of the emotive attributes. And so this is why we see that in Shemot chapter 33 verse 23 it says V'ra'ita et chorai ufanai lo yirau, that you saw my backside and you did not see my face. So we see this right there in Chumash on a very simple level, like getting away from Kabbalah for a second. We see very clearly in Chumash it says that God tells Moshe that Moshe can experience God's backside, but he will never see his face. And so now we understand Kabbalistically what this is referring to is that Moshe Rabeinu was incapable of experiencing this inner aspect, which is called the face. Panim in Hebrew is also related to the word pnimius, which means inwardness. That face of God, that inwardness of God on the level of the supernal Chokhmah and the level of supernal Keter, that was inaccessible to Moshe directly. The only way that he was able to access this Chokhmah was the superficial external aspect of Chokhmah as it was enclosed in Bina, as it was enclosed within the 7 sephiros, the 7 lower sephiros, and ultimately in an inward way in those lower 4 sephiros. And the Alter Rebbe says that you can look this up more if you're curious about reading about this more. You can look in the Shar HaNevuah of the Arizal, chapter 1. So one way, so if all of this seems really abstract to you, so I'm going to just like veer away from the text for a little bit here to just kind of maybe bring this a little bit down to earth. What we mean by external chachma, inward chachma, all this stuff, whatever, is let's say you have a person, you have a woman or a man who's an architect, and they're really, really smart person. Maybe this is a friend of yours, maybe a relative or something like that. They're brilliant. They're super brilliant. And they're so smart that it's like you really can't really totally understand them. And you meet them and you're just like, you're like baffled by their brilliance. And you can like appreciate that this is a really smart person. But if they start getting into all the details of architecture, and maybe they're into things that have nothing to do with architecture also, it's like it just goes above your head. You don't really understand what they're talking about. You can appreciate them superficially, but you can't really appreciate them in an inward way, right? So this would be sort of like being able to appreciate that external chachma, but not being able to appreciate the inward chachma. You can't really have a face-to-face deep conversation about the ins and outs of architecture because you're just not well versed in it. For the sake of this argument, I'm sure some of the listeners might be, but I'm assuming, let's say we're taking a scenario where the person listening is not. So now what if you were with this architect, right? And the architect saw like you really just don't understand what they're saying. You can't grasp their intellect, at least not in a full deep way. But then let's say they show you some of the designs that they're working on, some of the blueprints of some buildings that they're working on. Most likely, again, if you are not an architect, and especially if these designs are super complex, maybe they have different codes on them and stuff like that, you can maybe appreciate the artistry of it. Maybe it looks really beautiful and you can see that there's something really deep there, but you're not going to understand the ins and outs of it. You're not going to understand the inner depth of it all. So that would be sort of like the example of like these lower sephiros, the way the chachma becomes manifest within the bina and within the first few emotive attributes and all of that. But then let's say that what this building was actually a home for you. It was your own personal home that this architect was designing to your specifications. And now you were in that home, and now you were there, and you look around and you see the home. And now you appreciate it because now you see that like, oh, wow, look, there's an elevator there that you really wanted. There's that kitchen with the island in the middle that you really love. It's so beautiful and all these things. Now you can appreciate it in a really internal way. So now you can really appreciate that architect, not just in a way of like from afar and sort of like just superficially, but you can actually have a very deep and inward appreciation for this architect. And this appreciation you're having for the architect is really truly for their mind. It's for the wisdom that you were unable to fully access before. So you couldn't access it in a direct way. You could only access it in a superficial way before. But now that it's come down into this manifest physical world, into the manifest physical home, now you can appreciate that same intellect in a more direct and revealed and inward way. So this is how we can kind of understand how this process works in terms of what Moshe Rabeinu was able to grasp about God in an internal way and what he was unable to grasp about God in an external way. So there were certain levels of God where it just went over and above his head. He could appreciate it superficially, but not really inwardly. But on the lower levels of Netzach Hod Yesod HaMalchus, that is where he was able to appreciate this inward level of God, which really was coming from the intellect of God, right? Because where did the house come from? The house came from the mind of the architect after all, right? Okay, now back to our text. Hopefully that made things a little bit more accessible. Back to the text is now the Alter Rebbe is going to conclude the section here with a question, the question I brought up in the beginning. He says that if you look in Devarim, on chapter 34, verse 10, it says very clearly, it says, "V'lo kam navi od b'Yisrael k'Moshe," that there never rose another prophet in Israel like Moshe Rabeinu, meaning to say Moshe Rabeinu was the greatest prophet that ever lived. There's nobody that was able to experience godliness on a level that was higher than Moshe Rabeinu. So if this is the case, this is where our question comes up, and this is what we're left with, how is it that the Arizal understood more than Moshe Rabeinu, and that he actually really elaborated and expounded upon many different things in a way of the internal aspects, even on the level of the sephiros, many sephiros above Chochmah and Keter of Atzilus. So if you study the teachings of the Arizal, not only does the Arizal get into the sephiros that are above that's a Chod Yesod Malchus, that are the sephiros of Chochmah, the sephiros of Keter, of Atzilus, all that stuff, and he talks about them not just in a superficial way, but he actually talks about them in this really inward way, about the internal. It's like he's going into the architect's brain and he's breaking down what's going on in that architect's brain. And even things that are above Keter and above Atzilus. So how is that possible? If no prophet was able to perceive and experience godliness higher than Moshe Rabeinu is like, he is it, then how is it the Arizal was able to write about and teach about levels that Moshe Rabeinu was not able to experience or to access? So that is our question that we're left with today. And stay tuned to be continued. That's kind of a cliffhanger for today, so stay tuned. And we are going to start to uncover an understanding of this tomorrow, and I will speak to you then. Thanks for listening to the It Is Taught podcast, hosted by Sarit Switzer. This podcast is dedicated in loving memory of my maternal grandfather, Avraham Yitzchak ben Binyamin HaKohen of blessed memory. Music by Shoshana. If you enjoyed this episode and would like to support the show, please share it with others and subscribe on YouTube, Apple iTunes, Spotify, or wherever you listen to podcasts. And make sure to leave us a 5-star review. To find out more about the It Is Taught project, including more information on my soon-to-be published book, please visit our website, itistaught.com. To catch the latest from me, follow me on Facebook, Instagram, and Twitter. Looking forward to speaking with you tomorrow, and until then, have a great day.